Thank you very much. It's absolutely fascinating to see what all the pioneer projects have achieved in such a relatively short space of time. We're going to move on now, and I'm delighted to welcome to our meeting this afternoon Fiona Heesen, who's with the Dot.Rural research element of Aberdeen University. I think Fiona's known to quite a few of you here, so there'll be some familiar faces for you. And Fiona's doing some research into sort of broadband connectivity and community resilience. She's going to talk to that, and we'll also touch on some of the evaluation and measurement elements, which we're very keen to be quite a key feature of the work we're doing, particularly with the pioneers. So I'll just hand over to Fiona. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, hello, everyone. To those I haven't had a chance to meet yet, my name is Fiona Heesen, and as Sandra just said, I am a PhD researcher with the Dot.Rural group at the University of Aberdeen. Dot.Rural specifically is aiming to sort of find digital solutions to rural challenges. So there are numerous projects happening, but my specific work is looking at the impact of community broadband projects on rural community resilience. Yeah, so to first take you through my presentation, I'm going to give you a bit of background about myself, where I'm coming from, and about my research. I'm going to look at resilience in the context of community resilience. So we often hear resilience to do with maybe network resilience, but today we're going to speak about community resilience specifically. Then I'm going to talk about community broadband and its links with resilience. And finally, we're going to touch on impact, how we might actually go about evaluating the projects that everyone here in the room is working on, and hopefully conclude with some key messages that people can take away. So just beginning with my background, which I like to call my past, present, and future. Very simply, I come from a very varied background. I'm from a small town in Canada, so I've always been interested in rural issues. I've worked and studied in fields such as economics, rural planning, town planning, as well as sort of human-based social geography. And that really brings me to the present, where I'm doing my PhD at Aberdeen, looking at rural community resilience and the potential influence that digital services can have in rural communities. The context for this research is going to be the community-led broadband group. And I put that as my future, but it's really ongoing, and it's going to be ramping up over the next 2 years as I work to conclude the PhD. We often hear of the benefits of connectivity, and really my work is trying to investigate that further and really understand the real impact in the context of community resilience. Just looking at resilience for a moment, again I mentioned that we've already talked about network resilience, but I'm going to be speaking about community resilience. It's a term that's gained momentum, particularly in policy documents in the last few years, and that's not only in the UK but internationally as well. In EU documents, we see resilience being used. And if we start using terms like resilience in our own work and in our own sort of community-led groups, we'll see that it's quite easy to start resonating with the higher level policy documents and relate very quickly to policymakers. So despite the many definitions, I've chosen to use a very simple definition for today, which is the ability for a community group or individual to adapt to change. There are sort of two things I want to point out here. First is that resilience is no longer about returning to a steady state, returning to a state prior to a shock, which is sort of the traditional term of resilience, but rather it's about adapting to change, developing new trajectories for the future, and building adaptive capacities within our communities. Secondly, I firmly believe that change is actually now the norm. It's not abnormal for things to shift, for us to have societal and economic shifts, especially in our rural communities. So change is really the norm. Sometimes we might see it as gradual, things moving forward in roughly continuous and maybe predictable ways, but other times it's sudden, disorganizing, very turbulent. And this really challenges the adaptive capacity of our communities and of society in general, particularly in rural communities where you have other issues such as sparse and dispersed populations, limited access to public services. Change can really be quite a big shift. So if we start thinking about resilience and using it as a lens to understand the impact of digital services, we might be able to provide a better nuanced understanding and also relate very quickly to the policymakers. If we just look at this graph here, and this came from a UK academic about resilience, and it depicts sort of the before disruption or for change, and the period of readjustment afterwards, and the period of recovery. And the idea of trying to sort of build up our adaptive capacities so that this period of readjustment is limited. But I would argue that we're always on some spectrum of this, as change is a constant, is now the status quo. So now to move on to community broadband. And many people in this room are far more knowledgeable to speak on this. We've already heard from people such as Applecross with their pilot project today, and all the other community organizations as well, and we'll hear about this into tomorrow. So I've just put it into sort of two very basic stages of community-led broadband as a process. And the first is actually designing and developing the network. This is the mapping stage. This is going out and understanding what speeds are currently available, what people want, and that sort of thing. And the second, of course, is the actual implementation of that technology. So if we sort of look at these two very, very simple aspects to community-led broadband, we can easily identify two streams of resilience that may have a relationship. The first, of course, is the actual use of internet. People speak up about potential educational opportunities because they're able to be online, working from home. So we can start to see very, very quickly that there could be the ability to develop new capacities through that. The second, of course, is actually the process of going about designing and developing the network. That is going to build capacities in your community. It's going to help you identify perhaps capacities and resources you already had, but it will enable you to develop new ones as well. So from this, we see resilience as a method and as a way to view community growth and community development, and perhaps understand the influence of broadband on community living and working. So I'm just going to go to impact. This is something we hear very often. I really think we should not forget to think about the impact of the projects that everyone here in this room are working on. Since we spend, again, most of our time defining things for business plans, reports, and the like, I just provided a very simple definition. The impact is the demonstrable contribution that a process or innovation makes to society and the economy. I'm quick to include both process and innovation because, as I said before, I firmly believe that the process of everyone coming together, coming to these meetings, networking, is building capacities, and it's not simply the technology that is going to create a difference in our communities. Because of this, we also must acknowledge that impact may not be as tangible as we would like, and reporting on impact and describing impact is going to be rather complex. So we know about impact, we know about resilience as a way to perhaps view impact, but how are we actually going to go about gathering this information? The first thing that most people will turn to in terms of trying to measure it is the idea of an impact metric or impact factors. First of all, in any sphere of social life, it's not easy to assess how much influence a particular product or innovation may have on another sphere of life. It's not always cut or dry. Often we try to perhaps monetize things and understand it in a financial term. So if we have 5 new businesses in the communities, that's profits of X for the individuals running them. They might contribute to the local economy in such a way. So understanding it in a monetary ways is fairly simple and straightforward. However, that can't always be, monetary values cannot always be attributed to every level of impact. And often the metrics simply tell us about occasions of influence. So 75% of our community want broadband. That is a very important thing to know. But it doesn't really tell us anything about what's the outcome of the use. Are they developing a new social bond by being able to go online and interact with other blog users, for example? Are they becoming entrepreneurs, which was something they hadn't even considered doing before? So in terms of evaluating broadband, I really believe that we need to move towards understanding the outcomes of use and not simply get trapped in repeating the occasions of influence. Yes, so as I said, trying to understand real impact and really trying to develop your outcome areas. This kind of brings me to the final point there, which is taking control of your research agenda and your story. These are pioneering communities. A lot of people here are taking control and doing things for themselves. And the same goes for saying what your story is, telling sort of the rest of the UK and social media, for example, what you're doing in your community and what potential impact it's having. So each group should perhaps start to think about that, not just thinking about how you're going to build the network, but what sort of outcomes are you wanting from it, and making sure that your story gets heard. Another thing to think about as well is scale. Again, this is a very, very simple demonstration of scale, but we often start with identifying that in rural communities, you first have the community scale and you have the individual scale. And under those, you might have social impacts and economic impacts. And rarely do they exist in distinct silos, but there often are blurred lines. But you might be able to identify, say, on an individual level, entrepreneurs are able to now work from home, so they're going to stay in the community. So that's individually, they now are able to run their own business. Perhaps that's increasing their well-being. But then also conversely, on a community scale, because they're now able to stay in the community, they might contribute to the local economy, go out to the shops, take part in various social events. So there's impacts that cross various scales, but it's important to think about scales as well. So I just thought I'd provide this as just an example. This is the research process that my PhD is taking. And a lot of you will have actually already started thinking about these things, but maybe not thought about it in the context of, I'm assessing the impact. Understanding sort of and setting the background context, many of you are already doing, and trying to understand what your current broadband availability is, what options you have, what people actually want. Now, I've split up my research into looking at sort of pre-connectivity and post-connectivity, because again, we're looking at the potential impact of the technology as well. And this is something that I'm putting into play both in Bagel with Amanda, and also in the Barn project in Lancashire in England. Yeah. So just to sum up, because I think we're a bit over time, but when we're trying to think about evaluating a program like Community Broadband Scotland, it's a very large program, and each project within it must be considered in its local context. Each type of technology that's being deployed is going to change how the community may interact with outside users, bringing in external companies, that sort of thing. So we really need to think about each project as sort of its own distinct impact and understanding the local context before you can then draw lessons for the whole project. I've just mentioned specifically here this sort of importance of playmakers, the people that set the scene, that stage the show, and every other bad pun I can think about in theatre. These are the people that are directly involved in the process of broadband development, and they have a strong position in dictating the path of that development. There's a Carnegie Trust report on resilience, actually, that identifies key actors, but I believe that they strongly resonate with the community digital sector as well. And there's three roles. There's the activist, which we might call the digital champion, or the person that's spearheading the community to get better broadband. There's the professionals, the people that enable collaborations, that perhaps enable technology mapping, say if your community group doesn't have a technologist sort of already there. Then, of course, there's the funders and the policymakers, and these may be on a very large scale, big lottery, maybe the government level, or they might be local community groups that can provide funding. So it's important to identify those roles within each of the projects and identify perhaps where those roles are lacking, and that could be a spot as well for CBS to step in and provide support to the projects. So I will finish there, and I welcome any questions. I think hopefully we have a bit of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fiona. And thank you for helping us catch up on some time. We do have some time for some questions for Fiona. Fiona has to leave after the session today. She won't be with us tomorrow, so now is your time. I mean, one thing I can definitely relate to is change is the norm. I think we can all understand that. And just to reiterate as well, in terms of Community Broadband Scotland, we've been given an investment from government, and we need to report back on that investment. And it's not good enough just to report back in terms of what the money was spent on and the activities that we've done. It's very much about looking at the difference that money and that investment has made, looking at the overall impact. Mm-hmm. So we'll definitely take some pointers from your presentation. But I'd like to open it up to the floor. Any questions for Fiona? Alison? Get the microphone from Sean.
Yeah.
It was really more to CBS rather than Fiona.
Yeah, that's fine.
Relating to impact. Are you expecting the communities to start measuring impact? In which case we need to start thinking about it really almost straight away.
Yeah. Absolutely. What we'll be doing is we'll be sort of working with some assistants to actually see what are the parameters and what are the sort of the key measures that we're going to start capturing. At the stage that we're at, we haven't yet fully worked that up, but we wouldn't be looking at putting the onus entirely on the Pioneer projects. We'd be looking at very much working with you and through our CBS advisors at capturing some of the sort of baseline data, which...
Mm-hmm. So if you want the before data, you better hurry up with Apple
Absolutely,
because we're not hanging around it.
Yes, and part of the process that you're doing in terms of demonstrating to us the need for support will be giving us some raw data, and that will be a key element of it. But you're absolutely right, you know, it's completely wrong to wait until the end of the programme to then start thinking about evaluation. It's on our list of things to do. There's a few other things on that list as well, but it's definitely up there. And we totally recognise the need and the value of doing it. And it's a key part of us sharing the experiences and the learning. Through any programme, we're always looking for continual improvement. And if we don't measure that, it's then very difficult for us to articulate that going forward. But yes, it is definitely. We will be back in touch with you fairly soon with an overview of how we look to take things forward.